I was sitting at the edge of the couch sorting a small stack of letters when I heard a sharp whisper from the hallway. My nephew's voice carried through the half-closed door with a tension that made me lift my head. "I'll get his account today." The words were low, fast, and meant to stay hidden, but they reached me clearly enough to feel like a cold tap on the spine. The danger wasn't loud. It was precise. I kept still, letting the room stay quiet around me as the sentence settled. His tone wasn't frustrated the way families sometimes argue. It carried urgency, like someone who had already decided what he planned to take and was simply choosing the moment. I didn't move from my spot. I only listened to the hushed reply from his mother, my sister too soft to make out, but close enough that the conversation wasn't casual. A few seconds later, footsteps approached. I lowered my eyes to the letters again, pretending to read, letting the paper rest lightly between my fingers. He stepped into the doorway with a forced smile, the kind people use when they want to hide the heat still sitting behind their face. His eyes darted toward the table where my wallet lay beside the envelopes. The shift in his attention was small, but sharp enough to mark. He walked past me into the kitchen, but I saw his hand brush the mail stack on his way by. More curiosity than accident. When he reached the counter, he paused just long enough for me to notice him glancing at the return addresses on the envelopes. His posture stayed relaxed, but his focus stayed fixed on anything tied to my finances. I rose slowly and walked to the table under the pretense of organizing the rest of the mail. One envelope that had been sealed earlier now sat with the flap slightly lifted, the adhesive broken without tearing. He leaned against the counter, watching me in the reflection of the microwave door. When our eyes met, he gave another soft smile, lighter than the first, like he wanted to smooth over something he assumed I didn't catch. I placed the opened envelope aside without comment. He waited a beat, then made an offhand remark about needing to run an errand later, before disappearing down the hallway. His voice sounded calm again, but the earlier whisper still hung in the air, shaping each small detail he left behind. I stood alone in the quiet room, looking at the shifted mail, the loosened seal, the shadow of intent behind his smile. Nothing was broken, nothing missing, nothing dramatic. But the first line had been drawn clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. The fall I'd taken a month earlier had left a deep bruise across my hip and a stiffness that slowed my steps more than I wanted to admit. My sister insisted I stay with him until I healed, and her son agreed before I even finished explaining what happened. They framed it as concern, a simple way to keep me safe while I regained strength. I accepted because arguing felt heavier than the pain itself, and I thought a few weeks under their roof would pass quietly. Once I settled in, my nephew positioned himself as the one handling anything that required attention. When I pulled out my bank card to order a new medication, he drifted closer under the guise of helping with the website. His eyes stayed on the numbers longer than necessary, following each movement of my hand as if studying the pattern. He offered to manage the bills for the month, claiming it would give me more time to rest. I declined gently, but the offer didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a trial balloon to see how much I would surrender. My sister defended each of his actions with a soft certainty. She said he was just being protective, that he didn't want me overwhelmed while recovering. She repeated this often enough that it felt scripted, as though she had accepted his explanation without looking closely at the behavior behind it. Whenever I handled my mail or checked my bank app, she glanced at him first, waiting for his reaction before forming her own. One afternoon, while I was reviewing a statement on my phone, she mentioned a small purchase I had made at the pharmacy earlier that week. It was something I hadn't spoken about to anyone. The detail itself wasn't important. The fact she knew it was. The realization moved through me slowly, like a cold draft you don't notice until it reaches your neck. Someone had told her, and the only person close enough to see it was her son. I didn't question her. I didn't show the shift I felt inside. Instead, I nodded and let her continue talking, listening to the way her words flowed from a place of trust she didn't know was being misused. The privacy of my own financial habits, something I had guarded my entire adult life, had begun slipping into someone else's hands without my permission. As the day went on, I watched my nephew move through the house with a quiet confidence, checking things that weren't his to check, touching things he had no reason to touch. Nothing dramatic happened. No lines were spoken that forced an argument. But doubt settled in, clean, precise, undeniable. Something about his help didn't feel like help anymore. The bank statement arrived in the late afternoon, slid under my door with the rest of the mail. I opened it at the kitchen table, letting the pages fall open flat. Near the top was a notice I had never seen before. Multiple attempted password resets over the past week. I read the lines twice, making sure I wasn't misreading the dates. Each attempt was marked within minutes of one another, all during hours when I had been sitting in the living room or resting in my room. My nephew walked in while I was looking at it. Before I could ask anything, he glanced at the page and said it was just an automatic security check the bank did sometimes. His voice carried that confident tone he used whenever he wanted a question to die. Quickly, I'd been a customer at that bank for 30 years and had never seen anything like it. But I only nodded and set the statement aside. When I sorted the rest of the mail, I noticed one envelope's flap was lifted slightly, the adhesive broken. I had sealed it myself the night before. The tear wasn't careless. It was neat, done by someone who wanted to look without being detected. I held it up to the light briefly, then slid it back into the stack without comment. Later, he approached me again with a rushed explanation about checking for scams, because older accounts get targeted more. The pace of his speech didn't match the calm expression he tried to hold. It felt like he was patching a hole he had created himself. That evening, my sister mentioned a balance update I had looked at earlier in the week. I had checked it on my phone, quietly, while sitting in the bedroom with the door closed. I hadn't spoken about it to anyone. Hearing her repeat the numbers so casually made something settle uncomfortably in my chest. She assumed I had told her. I hadn't. Someone had. I watched my nephew move through the living room as she spoke. His eyes flicked toward my wallet on the table before he shifted his attention back to the conversation. The movement was small, but the interest behind it wasn't. He lingered a moment too long before walking past. Pieces that once seemed unrelated began to sit closer together. Password resets, open mail, repeated numbers, explanations that didn't hold their shape. Nothing was large enough to confront on its own, but each inconsistency added a quiet weight to the others. The contradictions weren't loud, but they were clear. Something in the story he kept telling didn't line up with the facts sitting in front of me. I waited until the house was quiet before opening my banking app. The activity log sat near the bottom of the screen, a feature I rarely used. This time, I scrolled through every entry slowly. One line stopped me. Login attempt from unfamiliar location. When I tapped it, the map opened to a small office building on the other side of town, my nephew's workplace. The timestamp matched an afternoon when I had been sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper with my phone beside me. My fingers tightened around the device, not in fear, but in a growing, steady focus. The next morning, I sorted the fresh mail and felt a stiff edge behind a stack of catalogs. When I pulled it out, I found a financial notice addressed to me, one that should have been in my direct pile. It had been tucked behind unrelated letters, wedged just enough to stay hidden unless someone looked carefully. I set it aside without comment, placing it face down on the table. Later, while clearing dishes, I caught a brief reflection in the microwave door. My nephew, standing near the end of the counter with my checkbook in his hand. He wasn't writing anything. He was holding his phone above it. By the time I stepped into the room, he had slipped both items back where they belonged. He greeted me with a casual question about dinner, his voice smooth, as if nothing had happened seconds earlier. That afternoon, my sister mentioned that he had helped verify something on my account because the bank just wanted to confirm a detail. Her tone was light, unbothered, unaware of the weight behind her words. I hadn't needed any verification. I hadn't requested anything, but someone had. To test what I already suspected, I left a new envelope on the table with a small pencil mark on the inside flap. Nothing obvious, just a line only I would notice once the seal broke. I placed it where he regularly hovered, then left the room. When I returned hours later, the flap was pressed back down, but no longer sealed. The mark I'd drawn sat exposed, confirming someone had opened it. There was no mess, no sign of carelessness, just quiet precision. Standing there, I let the pattern settle. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't imagination or age. Someone was tracking my financial movements closely, making small, deliberate choices in the background of my days. The line between help and intrusion had already been crossed, and the evidence now sat neatly in front of me. This was no longer doubt. It was fact. I drove to the bank early in the morning, choosing a time when the lobby stayed quiet and the staff had not yet settled into the rhythm of the day. The banker who greeted me recognized my name, and led me to a small office with glass walls and a muted computer screen waiting to be woken. I handed her my ID and asked if she could review the recent security alerts on my account. My voice stayed calm, but I felt a weight in my chest I couldn't ignore. She clicked through several screens before her expression changed. It wasn't shock, just a sudden seriousness that replaced her polite smile. She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. The flagged attempts weren't technical errors. They were manual password resets, each one initiated from an ATM and not from my phone, computer, or home network. I leaned in closer, reading the dates. All of them lined up with the times I'd been nowhere near a machine. A security officer joined us after she called him in. He sat down with a folder and pulled out a set of printed images. They were grainy stills from the ATM camera, clear enough to show my nephew standing at the machine, looking straight at the keypad. He wasn't withdrawing money. He was navigating menus, holding a small piece of paper with numbers written on it. The officer tapped the image quietly. He attempted to verify account ownership, he said, but the information didn't match. Another sheet showed the attempt form he had filled out. Under relationship, he had written the word guardian. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Seeing the lie in writing settled something sharp and heavy inside me. The officer flipped to the next page, showing a blocked request to transfer funds into a new account under a different name. The system had flagged it instantly, preventing the transfer, but logging the attempt. The banker typed for several minutes, her tone steady as she explained that all suspicious activity would be frozen immediately. No funds would move without my in-person approval. She printed the updated security status and slid it across the desk toward me. I folded the paper once and placed it carefully into my coat pocket. When I stepped out of the building, the morning air felt colder than when I had arrived. I walked slowly to the car, letting each detail arrange itself in my mind. Camera proof, written lies, transfer attempts. No confusion remained. No possibility of misunderstanding lingered. This was not curiosity, nor clumsy help, nor overstepped boundaries. It was deliberate exploitation, planned quietly under my own roof. The fraud specialist called me into a small back office after reviewing the notes the banker had entered. He spoke with the quiet precision of someone who had seen too many families torn apart by money. He laid out a printed summary of the attempts on my account, each one marked with a notation I hadn't seen before. Intent verification failure. When I asked what it meant, he turned the paper toward me and pointed to the highlighted section. He wasn't guessing passwords, he said. He was trying to establish himself as an authorized party. His tone stayed even, but the implication hit cleanly. I listened while he explained how people sometimes staged a pattern of assistance to build a trail of involvement. The more he spoke, the clearer his assessment became. He's building a case to take control, the specialist said. Not dramatic, not speculative, just fact. He pulled up a different entry on the screen, showing a request for temporary access forms. The signature listed as mine didn't match the one on my ID. He printed the page and handed it to me, letting the forged lines speak for themselves. The handwriting was sloppy, as if done quickly, but it attempted to copy the slant of my letters. The fraud specialist slid another page across the desk, an internal note that my nephew had asked questions about account management for medically declining clients. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice steady as I thanked him and left the office with the documents tucked into my coat. Back at the house, I waited until the rooms were empty before opening the drawer in the small desk my nephew used. Inside, beneath a pile of loose papers, I found a folder containing several photocopies of my ID and handwritten forms with my name signed in the same mismatched style as the bank's forgery. One sheet listed my date of birth and a note beside it. Eligibility for competency review? The words were underlined twice. I closed the drawer slowly and walked back to my room. The hardy air in the hallway felt different now, thicker, shaped by the knowledge that this wasn't an impulsive act, but a process he had built, step by step. I spent the next hour gathering every piece of evidence: printed logs, screenshots, forged signatures, camera stills. I changed each password, wrote the new ones down, and locked them inside my suitcase. I backed up the files onto a second drive and placed it inside an old jacket no one touched. As I finished, a quiet clarity settled in. He wasn't trying to steal a moment of access. He was preparing a full takeover, legal, financial, and permanent. There was no returning to doubt now. The mask had fallen, and what sat beneath it was unmistakable. I called my lawyer from the backyard, choosing a spot far from windows and open doors. The conversation was brief. I told him what I'd found, and he asked only for the facts, not the emotions behind them. When I finished, he exhaled once and told me to document everything before speaking a single word to anyone in the house. His tone carried no surprise, only preparation, as if he had walked clients through this kind of quiet betrayal before. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. My nephew moved through the rooms with a restless energy that didn't match his usual confidence. He hovered near me whenever I stood up, asking if I needed help, offering to carry things I'd never asked him to touch. Once, when I walked past him toward the kitchen, I felt his eyes drop to my jacket pocket as if checking whether something had been placed inside it. His attempts at casual conversation came forced, each one stretched thin by impatience. He wasn't waiting for me to recover anymore. He was waiting for an opportunity. My sister noticed the tension, but misunderstood its source. She asked why her son had become so urgent about managing my finances, insisting he was just trying to stay ahead of things. She smiled when she said it, unaware of the sharp edge behind his behavior. She repeated his reasoning without realizing how rehearsed it sounded. I didn't correct her. She wasn't the one planning anything. That evening, while they were distracted with a phone call in the living room, I slipped a small recorder behind the plant near the kitchen table. It blended into the shadows easily. The microphone pointed toward the chair where he liked to sit whenever we talked about anything involving money. I tested the angle once, then left the room exactly as I had found it. Back in my room, I arranged the evidence on the bed in careful rows: bank logs, screenshots, forged forms, timestamps, camera stills. I stacked the documents into a single folder, placed a digital backup inside my inner coat pocket, and kept a second copy inside a drawer he'd never bothered to open. The preparation steadied me. Each piece of proof formed a line he could no longer talk his way around. When he walked past my doorway later, I stepped out and spoke in the same steady tone I used before the fall that brought me here. "We should clarify something tomorrow morning," I said. "Kitchen table." He paused mid-step, eyes narrowing just enough to betray the calculation behind them. Then he nodded, masking the flicker of tension with a practiced smile. I closed my door quietly. By morning, everything would be in place. He was already at the kitchen table when I walked in, sitting straight-backed, hands folded, pretending he was calm. I set the folder down without a sound and took the chair across from him. The recorder hidden behind the plant blinked once, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. I kept my voice low and steady as I asked him why there were multiple attempts to access my bank account from his workplace. He snapped instantly, the mask falling faster than I expected. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, leaning forward, his tone sharp enough to cut through the quiet. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out tight. "You must be confused again." The words were meant to corner me, but I didn't move. I only reached for the folder and opened it slowly, letting each page land between us. The first screenshot showed the login attempts. The second showed the flagged resets. The third displayed a still image from the ATM camera, his face angled toward the keypad. His breath changed the moment he saw it. He reached for the papers with a suddenness that made the chair legs scrape hard against the tile. "You don't understand what these are," he said, voice rising, fingers brushing the edges as if he could tear the truth out of existence. I pulled the documents back before he could grab them. His hand hovered in the air for a moment, caught between panic and anger. He stood abruptly and moved toward the router, pressing buttons as if he could somehow erase what no longer depended on the network. The quiet whir of the machine filled the room as he worked frantically. When I stepped toward the doorway, he moved in front of me, blocking the exit. His posture shifted, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the folder under my arm. "You're not going anywhere with that," he said, voice low, trembling with something deeper than frustration. His hand reached out again, this time aiming for my phone. I held it close, letting him see that I wasn't intimidated. The recorder caught every word that followed. "I deserve that account," he hissed, no longer hiding the intention he had spent months building. "You're old. You don't even use half of what you have. Someone responsible should handle it." It was the clearest confession he had ever made, spoken without hesitation and without shame. I stepped back, just far enough that he couldn't touch me without making a choice he couldn't undo. His breathing turned sharp as the sound of footsteps approached from the hallway, the precise moment I had been waiting for. My lawyer's voice came first, calm and direct, followed by the officers entering behind him. I didn't look at my nephew again. I simply let them walk past me as I stepped aside. The truth laid bare on the table he once believed he controlled. The officers moved through the kitchen with a practiced steadiness, gathering the documents and the recorder without speaking more than necessary. One of them played back the key clip, the one where my nephew said he deserved the account. Another reviewed the ATM stills beside the printed transfer attempts. Their reactions remained neutral, shaped by procedure rather than emotion. But the silence in the room felt heavier with each confirmation. My nephew sat stiffly in a chair, refusing to look at me or the evidence. The officers read him the charges: attempted financial fraud, attempted coercive control, falsifying authorization. He answered nothing. He didn't protest or explain. He simply stared at the table he had once hovered over with confidence, knowing he could no longer control what happened next. When they escorted him out, he kept his head down, offering no final word. My sister stood near the hallway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She watched the officers lead her son outside, but her eyes stayed empty, as if she had been struck too hard to form an expression. I didn't try to comfort her. She didn't approach me. The truth between us was too heavy for words, and anything spoken now would only twist the moment into something it wasn't. After they left, my lawyer and I sat at the same kitchen table where everything had begun to unravel. He went through the next steps with clear, steady instructions: protective orders, account safeguards, documentation for long-term security. I signed each form slowly, feeling the weight of every signature. None of it brought relief. It only brought order. Later in the afternoon, the banker called to confirm that all fraudulent attempts had been locked down. My account access was reset, my alerts updated, and my information marked for high-level verification only. Her tone was respectful, careful, and far more serious than any conversation we'd had before. When I thanked her, the words came out quieter than I intended. That evening, I walked through the house alone, letting the room settle into a stillness they hadn't known for weeks. The walls, the hall, the small table near the entry, everything looked the same. But the meaning behind each corner had changed. I stood in the living room for a long moment, breathing slowly, letting the quiet return piece by piece. There was no victory in what happened, just confirmation, just consequence. Knowing the danger had come from family left a cold place inside me that no procedure could fully repair. But for the first time in a long while, the house felt steady again, not warm, not comforting, but safe in the simplest sense of the word. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed moved quietly, marked by small steps back into my own life. I handled my finances myself, sitting at the dining table each morning with my statements spread neatly in front of me. I checked every line, made every call, and kept every detail in order. Routines that once felt ordinary now carried a sense of purpose. They reminded me that control over my own affairs wasn't just practical. It was a form of dignity I hadn't realized I'd let slip. I spent time reorganizing the documents my nephew had once hovered over. I created clear folders, set new passwords, and stored the backups in a place only I could access. Each task settled something inside me, restoring ground that had quietly shifted under my feet without my noticing. Trust, I learned, is not something you surrender casually, even to those who carry your blood. As the days passed, I saw how easily concern can turn into opportunity for the wrong person. It doesn't happen loudly. It happens in small steps: offers of help, suggestions wrapped in kindness, explanations that sound sensible until you look closely. I had lived long enough to understand that danger doesn't always enter through force. Sometimes it enters through the people who believe they deserve a piece of your life simply because they are connected to it. I found myself speaking more plainly to other men my age, neighbors, acquaintances from the bank, anyone who had faced their own quiet battles with aging. I told them to monitor their accounts, check their statements often, and guard their documents even if they believed no one around them would misuse them. These weren't warnings delivered in fear. They were facts earned through experience. I returned to the bank and my lawyer again to finalize long-term protections. We tightened every access point, updated the legal safeguards, and arranged systems that required my explicit presence for any change. Their professionalism gave structure to the day, but the weight of what brought me there stayed heavy, reminding me that caution wasn't paranoia, it was self-respect. At home, the silence no longer carried tension. It felt steady, honest, unpolished in a way that suited me. I moved through each room without watching the doorways or listening for footsteps behind walls. My life wasn't repaired, it was reclaimed, and reclaiming it brought a kind of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's behavior. In the evenings, I sat near the window with a cup of tea, letting the quiet settle. I didn't revisit the past with anger, and I didn't search for explanations that would never come. I simply accepted the truth I had learned the hard way. Growing old isn't the danger, trusting the wrong person is.